I live alone, but every morning, my kitchen smells like someone else's coffee. I work the night shift at a 24-hour emergency veterinary clinic. Home by 7 a.m., asleep by 8, awake again around 3 in the afternoon, just in time to watch the last of the daylight disappear before heading back out. My life exists in the gaps that most people sleep through, and after a while, you stop noticing how strange that is. You stop noticing a lot of things. When the rent went up and my previous roommate left without much warning, I posted a listing for the spare bedroom. Sarah responded within 10 minutes of it going live. She paid 3 months upfront in cash, crisp, barely touched bills that looked like they'd come straight from a machine. She said she worked from home as a freelance transcriptionist. We almost never crossed paths. At the time, that felt like the perfect arrangement. The first week was fine. The second week, I noticed my toothbrush was wet, damp in the way it gets after use, even though I hadn't touched it since the morning before. I told myself I'd forgotten. Sleep deprivation does strange things to memory. By the third week, I found my heavy winter boots sitting at the foot of my bed, laces tied in careful double knots, perfectly parallel. I always left them by the front door. I hadn't worn them in 7 days. I started wondering if I was sleepwalking. Then I found a single, pale, blonde hair tangled in the bristles of my toothbrush. My hair is jet black. Sarah's was that particular shade of platinum that doesn't look entirely natural, almost white under certain light. I confronted her in the kitchen that afternoon. She was standing at the stove with her back to me, stirring a pot of something that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. When I asked her if she'd been using my bathroom, she didn't turn around, just kept stirring, the wooden spoon scraping slow circles against the metal. The pipes in mine were making a strange sound, she said, her voice completely flat. I didn't think you'd mind. You're never home anyway. No apology, no follow-up. Just the sound of that spoon. The day everything shifted, I was homesick with a migraine. Curtains drawn, cold cloth over my eyes, the apartment completely silent around me. I hadn't told Sarah I wasn't going in. I was lying still in the dark when I heard the floorboards outside my door. Not the sound of someone walking past, the sound of someone standing, shifting their weight slowly from one foot to the other, like they were trying not to make any noise at all. The sound stopped directly outside my door. I waited for a knock. Nothing. I waited for a voice. Nothing. After 3 full minutes, I counted every second. The brass doorknob began to turn. Slowly. A millimeter at a time, the door swung inward just a fraction, and through that narrow gap, I saw an eye. Pale blue, unblinking, staring directly at the place on the bed where my head rested. She watched me for 3 minutes. Then the door clicked shut, as quietly as it had opened. The next day, I bought a hidden camera disguised inside an alarm clock and angled it toward my bed. I left for my shift with my stomach in knots and came home the following morning, barely able to hold the memory card steady enough to slot it into my laptop. I scrubbed through hours of dark, empty footage until 3:14 a.m. when the door opened. Sarah walked in. But not the way a person walks. Her movements were rigid and jerky, like a marionette operated by someone still learning the strings. She crossed the room and stood beside my empty bed and stared down at the pillow where my head should have been. She didn't move for a full hour. Then she leaned down until her face was inches from the pillow, and she began to whisper. The camera's microphone caught it. A low, rhythmic sound that wasn't quite language. Vowels and consonants crushed together without meaning, without pause, cycling in a pattern that felt almost like practice, like something learning to imitate a voice it had only heard through a wall. The last night, I wedged a chair under the door handle and lay fully dressed on top of the covers, phone in my hand, screen glowing faintly in the dark. At exactly 3 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped so fast my breath came out in visible clouds. Then the footsteps started. Not the slow, deliberate creeping from before, but something frantic, erratic, pacing back and forth outside my door like whatever was out there had lost control of itself. The door handle rattled violently. I was already dialing when it stopped. Absolute silence. Then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. A single photograph. It was a picture of me, huddled in the corner of my own room, taken from the angle of the window directly behind me. 3rd floor. No fire escape. I turned around and the glass was almost completely frosted over, except for 2 perfect clear patches. Hand-shaped, pressed from the outside. I didn't wait for the police. I threw open the door and ran, and in the half-second it took me to pass Sarah's room, I looked inside. The room was completely empty. No bed, no clothes, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Except for a large, carefully constructed nest on the floor, built from clothing I hadn't been able to find for weeks, shredded newspaper, and hundreds of dark strands of hair, the exact same shade of black as mine. I sat on the curb outside until the patrol car arrived. The officers found the apartment exactly as I'd left it. Sarah was gone. When I contacted the management company the following week, they told me the background check had come back clean, but the social security number she provided belonged to a woman who had died in 1998. I check the locks twice every night now, and whenever the temperature in my room drops without reason, I don't look at the window anymore because I'm afraid of what I might see pressed against the glass, watching me from the outside of the 3rd floor. Still learning. I heard my own voice answer the phone. I was standing in the shower at the time. I moved into the apartment on Chicago's north side out of necessity, not choice. The building was a relic. Mustard yellow appliances, floors that peeled at the corners, walls so thin you could hear the neighbor in 4C sneeze and know whether it was allergies or a cold. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed out of my previous situation badly enough that I signed the lease the same afternoon I viewed it. My roommate David had already been living there for 3 months. Freelance software developer. Rarely left his room. Soft voice, stooped shoulders. The kind of person who apologizes for existing in shared spaces. Our rhythms barely overlapped. I managed a restaurant downtown, double shifts most nights, home after midnight smelling like kitchen grease and old wine. By the time I'd shower and wind down, the only sign of David was the pale blue glow seeping under his door and the faint, steady percussion of his mechanical keyboard. We spoke maybe 4 sentences a week. It felt like ideal roommate territory. Invisible to each other, 2 people using the same address. The first thing I dismissed as coincidence happened on a Sunday morning. I had a cold, the scratchy, unpleasant kind, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee when I coughed. One of those coughs that catches in the back of your throat. Half a second later, from behind David's closed door, came the exact same cough. Same pitch, same rough texture, same length. I paused. I cleared my throat. A short 2-beat sound I do without thinking. The same 2-beat sound came back from his room. I stood up and stood at his door and listened. Just the hum of his computer fan. I told myself we'd caught the same bug. I told myself the walls were thin. I went back to my coffee and let it go. But it kept happening. And it stopped being easy to explain. I have a habit of drumming my fingers on the counter while I wait for water to boil. Index, middle, ring, pinky. Always in that order. A rhythm I've done so long, I don't notice it anymore. One evening, I was standing at the stove and I heard it tapping back at me from his room. Exact sequence, exact tempo, synchronized with my own hand. I stood very still and kept drumming, and it kept following. I pulled my hand away. The tapping stopped. I'm not sure how long I stood there before I turned the stove off and went to bed without eating. Then the jacket. I came home one night wearing a vintage corduroy jacket I'd owned for years. Faded green, slightly worn at the elbows, missing a brass button on the left cuff. David was in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring at the television that wasn't on. He was wearing the same jacket. Not similar, identical, right down to the missing button. When I asked him where he got it, he didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the black screen and said in his flat, affectless voice, "I've always had this. It's my favorite jacket." I went to my room and locked the door and sat on the edge of my bed trying to slow my breathing down. I told myself there was a rational explanation. I almost believed it. The afternoon my shift was cut short changed everything. Power outage at the restaurant sent me home 6 hours early. And as I was still fitting my key into the lock, I heard a voice from inside the apartment. It took me a long moment to understand what I was hearing. It was my voice, not similar to mine. The exact cadence, the exact inflection, the specific way I trail off at the end of sentences when I'm relaxed. I pushed the door open an inch and looked through the gap. David was pacing in front of the window, phone to his ear, talking. He was laughing my laugh. The short, slightly breathless one I do when I'm nervous, which I've always hated about myself. "Yeah, Mom," he was saying. "The restaurant's been insane, but I'm still coming for Thanksgiving. Tell Sarah I said hi. My mother's name is Eleanor. My sister's name is Sarah." He knew her name. He was talking to my mother in my voice about plans I had actually made, using memories that belonged to me, inhabiting my life with a fluency that meant he had been listening to me for a very long time. After that, I stopped sleeping properly. I moved the dresser against my bedroom door at night. I dreaded going to the kitchen. Whenever I did, he'd appear within seconds, standing in the corner, his posture arranged to match mine exactly. Arms crossed when mine were, weight shifted to the same foot. He never acknowledged he was doing it. He just watched me with that blank, patient expression and mirrored everything I did. And I began to understand that what I'd mistaken for shyness or social awkwardness was something else entirely. Something methodical. The night of the storm was the last night. The power went out across the whole building. I was sitting on my bed in the dark, holding a flashlight, when I heard his door open. Slow footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside my door. I held absolutely still. Then his voice came through the thin wood. Except it wasn't his voice, it was mine. And it was calm in the way that is worse than any shouting. "I know you're awake in there. You're breathing too fast." I packed a bag in the dark with shaking hands. I knew if I waited until morning, I wasn't going to leave. I opened the door and put the flashlight beam straight into the hallway. And he was standing there, 3 feet away. He had shaved his head to match my haircut. He was wearing my clothes. The band shirt I'd had since college, my jeans, my boots. But it was his face that I couldn't look away from. His features were pulled into a rigid imitation of the expression I could feel on my own face. Wide eyes, real fear, replicated. He looked like a mirror that had learned to move on its own. He opened his mouth, and when he spoke, the sound seemed to come from somewhere behind my own sternum. "You don't need to pack," my voice said. "We're already home. There doesn't need to be 2 of us." He took 1 step toward me, his hands reaching out, his fingers arranged around empty air in the exact shape of mine around the flashlight. I swung it, connected with his shoulder. He didn't react. No sound, no flinch. But the impact shifted him just enough, and I got past him, and I ran, and I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, under a gas station awning, with rain coming down so hard I couldn't hear myself think. The police searched the apartment. David's room was empty of everything except a corkboard that covered the entire far wall. Hundreds of photographs pinned in rows. Me, sleeping. Me at work. Me walking down streets I walked every day. Shot from behind. No computer, no clothes, no bed. The landlord had no record of a second tenant. The lease was only ever in my name. Months later, my sister called me. She sounded confused, a little worried. She said I had left her a voicemail in the middle of the night. No words, just humming. An obscure song I used to love as a kid. one I hadn't thought about in years. She asked if I was doing all right. I hadn't called her. I hadn't called anyone that night. I still don't know who did. It took me 3 months to realize my roommate wasn't hoarding junk. He was rebuilding my childhood bedroom in the basement. I moved into the Victorian house on the outskirts of Boston because grad school debt doesn't negotiate. The place was enormous in the way that old houses get enormous. Not spacious, just full of extra hallways that led nowhere useful, floors that sloped toward the center like the building was slowly folding in on itself, radiators that clanged through the night like something was trapped inside them. There were supposed to be 3 of us, splitting the rent, but one roommate left for California 2 months in, and suddenly it was just me and Greg rattling around in this drafty, wood-paneled house that was too big for 2 people, and knew it. Greg was in his late 30s, worked nights as an archivist at a historical society, and operated with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that other people were mostly an inconvenience. He paid his half of the rent in folded cash left on the kitchen island. He nodded when we passed in the hallway. He washed his dishes immediately after using them and put everything back in exactly the right place. I was buried in my thesis and running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee most days, so his near total absence from my life felt like a gift. I wasn't looking for a friend. I just needed someone to split utilities with while I finished the degree. The disappearances started small enough that I blamed myself. I was disorganized, sleep-deprived, the kind of person who sets something down and genuinely cannot account for it 20 minutes later. So when a coffee mug went missing, a chipped, ugly ceramic thing I'd painted at summer camp when I was 10 and kept for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I searched the kitchen twice and then let it go. When a frayed charging cable that only worked if you bent it at a specific 90-degree angle vanished from my nightstand, I assumed I'd thrown it out in a fog and forgotten. But then one of my lawn sneakers disappeared from the back porch. Just the left one. A single grass-stained shoe with no pair, no explanation, no logical destination. You don't misplace one shoe. You don't throw away one shoe. I stood on the back porch for a long time, looking at the space where it had been, and something in the back of my mind began, very quietly, to pay attention. It was only when I started mapping the disappearances against my own conversations that the pattern became impossible to ignore. Greg and I had been in the kitchen at the same time one evening, rare enough that I'd tried to fill the silence with small talk. I mentioned that the rain reminded me of the storms we used to get back home in Ohio, and how I used to wait them out under this wool blanket my grandmother had made, scratchy and heavy, and somehow the most comforting thing in the world. 2 days later, the blanket was gone. It had been folded at the bottom of my closet for 2 years, untouched. The following week, a friend came over, and we spent an hour laughing about a terrible indie band we'd loved in high school, and I mentioned a torn poster I still had rolled up in a cardboard tube under my bed. The next morning, the tube was empty. I sat on the floor of my room holding it, and felt the specific cold that comes not from temperature, but from understanding something you wish you didn't. He wasn't taking random things. He was listening to every word I said, filing it away, and then going to find the physical object that matched the memory. He was collecting evidence of a life that belonged to me. The night of the storm, I was alone in the house when the power went out. A transformer down the street, the whole block going dark at once. I needed the breaker box, which was in the basement. Greg kept the basement padlocked, had since the day I moved in, said it was full of fragile archival materials from the Historical Society, and he needed to control the humidity. I had never questioned it. That night, the padlock was hanging open on the hasp. I took my flashlight and went down. The smell hit me before my eyes adjusted. Not the mildew and cold concrete I expected. Fresh paint and lavender laundry detergent. The specific brand my mother used throughout my entire childhood. A scent I hadn't encountered in years and recognized instantly in the way you recognize smells before you recognize anything else. My hand tightened around the flashlight and I kept going down the stairs. The basement was completely clear of boxes or storage. In the center of the concrete floor, under bare pipes and wooden beams, Someone had built a room, 4 walls of new drywall, a white interior door, a small square window set at the right height for a child, a room inside the basement of the house I lived in, constructed in secret over God knows how many months. I looked through the window and my mind did something strange. It simply refused to process what it was seeing for a few seconds. Like a loading screen, like a computer stalling on a file it wasn't built to open. The walls inside were painted yellow, not just any yellow. The specific, faded, slightly uneven yellow of my bedroom from when I was 8 years old, a color I hadn't seen since my parents repainted the house when I was 12. The furniture, all of it thrifted and modified, was arranged in the exact layout of that room, a layout I hadn't consciously thought about in 15 years, but recognized with an immediacy that felt almost physical. My summer camp mug on the desk, my grandmother's wool blanket draped over the end of the bed, the torn poster pinned at exact height on the wall. Everything I'd mentioned, everything I'd described in passing, everything I'd thought I'd lost, assembled and arranged with the care of someone who believed they were building something sacred. I heard the floorboard creak at the top of the stairs and turned around. Greg was standing on the landing, looking down at me. He didn't look like a man who'd been caught doing something wrong. He looked like a man who'd just watched someone open the gift he'd spent all year making. His eyes were wide and bright with something I can only describe as genuine joy. And that was the most frightening thing about it. He wasn't disturbed by my presence. He was delighted. He came down the stairs slowly, deliberately, the way you move towards something fragile. "You found it," he said quietly, his voice shaking with excitement. "I didn't think it was ready yet. I'm still missing the model airplane. The P-51 Mustang. You said it hung over the window, right?" I hadn't told him about the airplane in any conversation I could remember, which meant there were conversations I couldn't remember, which meant he'd been listening longer than I knew. He reached into his pocket and held up an iron key, heavy and old-fashioned, and took another step toward me. "It's safe in there," he said. "Nothing changes in there. You don't have to grow up. The collection is almost complete. It's time to go in." I swung the flashlight. The metal connected with his jaw, and the sound it made echoed off the concrete walls, and I was already moving before he hit the ground. Up the stairs on my hands and knees, through the kitchen, out the front door into the blizzard. I ran for over a mile in the snow in my socks until I reached a diner with lights on and people inside, and I sat in a booth, shaking for an hour before I called anyone. The police found the basement room exactly as I'd left it. Greg was gone. He'd gone out into the storm, and they never found him that night or after. Weeks later, the detective handling the case called me in to go over the evidence photos and pointed out something I had missed in my panic. Something he said had stayed with him. The furniture in that room, the desk, the bed, the chair, none of it was sized for a 25-year-old. He had built it all to the proportions of an 8-year-old child. The bed was the length of a child's bed. The chair sat at a child's height. The clothes hanging in the closet were a child's size. He wasn't trying to return me to my childhood. He was trying to put the version of me he wanted. The one that couldn't leave, couldn't grow, couldn't question anything, into a room and lock the door. I don't know how long he'd been planning it before I moved in. I don't know if I was chosen or if I was just whoever happened to sign the lease. I don't know what he would have done once the collection was complete. I think about that iron key sometimes. How cold it looked in his hand. How certain he was that I was going to go through that door. I never went back for my things. I didn't want any of them anymore.